Not too long ago for my 100th video, I did my top 100 films of all time. Well, I recently revisited a movie and that viewing made that video null and void because unfortunately, Vertigo has been kicked off the island and I'd like to welcome our latest contestant, 1980's The Elephant Man, directed by David Lynch. It's a film I've liked before, but was never my favourite Lynchian work. Well, in all honesty, it feels very non-Lynchian in themes and concept. Lynch's most celebrated works are usually kind of pessimistic. He always feels like he's uncovering the ugliness underneath the beauty. The most shining and masterful example of that is Twin Peaks. But The Elephant Man is the complete opposite of that. It's Lynch exploring the beauty underneath the deformed and feared. It's a heartbreaking story, depressing and violently cruel, but in the end, hopeful. So on my latest rewatch, the film just hit much harder than it ever did before. I mean, from the very beginning, aside from the mysterious dream sequences, once we cut to Anthony Hopkins' character Frederick, who is intrigued by the Elephant Man exhibition at the local freak show, the mystery captures you immediately. It's the perfect example of showing and not telling whilst not showing much at all. We just have this kind of argument between this businessman who runs the freak show and the police who are trying to put an end to it. You see, the Elephant Man is being seen as too horrific for even a freak show, which at the time were just spectacle shows displaying people with rare and odd disabilities, ranging from things such as conjoined twins, bearded ladies, little people, and even just simply albino people. By today's standards, freak shows were extremely exploitative, but there's also the other edge to the sword where these people had nowhere else to go. And this was their only way to live a life and make an earning semi-safely. They're also benefited by being surrounded by others who are socially outcast for their abnormalities. And it is very sad that their only refuge in this world is a place where they're exploited by the people who have to home them and care for them and feed them. But the Elephant Man, known as John Merrick in the film, isn't even welcomed here by audiences, so just hearing this makes you need to know what he looks like, and once it's revealed to the audience along with Frederick, we're all in shock in unison, but not just because of what he looks like, but the horrific conditions he's so obviously being subjected to. Frederick sheds a single tear, and the image of that is so powerful because in one single look and one single tear, we recognize that he instantly feels the pain and history of this man. He doesn't see a freak, he sees an entire existence lived in pain, neglect, and abuse. Also, the freak show owner labels himself the owner of not just the freak show, but of these people, of this man, as if he's some kind of dog or wild animal. It shows not only the kind of man that he is, but the kind of experience Merrick has lived, even referred to as a creature. A mythological story has been created to give him a background of an almost sinister and grandiose nature, when in fact it's just much sadder than that. Because nothing happened to his mother to create him this way, he was just simply born into an incurable existence, which I think scares people more when it seems so easily possible to happen to anybody. I think that's why they make the note of his mother being beautiful multiple times, but if you imagine a fairy tale where extreme circumstances have created John Merrick, well, then it becomes much easier for people to separate him from them, which is incredibly depressing. And I think it's worth a mention now that this film feels old. And yes, it's from 1980, making it 43 years old as of 2023, but it feels much older than that. Obviously, the black and white lends itself to that, but the grain, the sets used, the general aesthetic, the lighting choices, framing choices, and the audio quality, they all give this 40s feel, even 30s. The reasons behind this are kind of ambiguous. I don't think Lynch has ever really explored why he did this, but it's probably to give it a classic feel, maybe even a classic Universal monster movie feeling. Mostly in the vein of Frankenstein, who oddly has quite a lot in common with John Merrick. Someone seemingly deemed a monster for simply their looks, which are out of their control, hidden away and hated by society, called a monster for simply existing. But also, I think the cinematography and filmmaking techniques are there to sort of aid John Merrick's appearance. In colour, his deformities might have been too much for a 1980s audience. Seeing the spectrum of beige, brown and pinks might have just been too grotesque, but in black and white, his appearance is more intriguing and palatable. And once we get used to his appearance, as does Frederick, his story develops at a beautifully painful pace. I mean, the scene where he gets shown to the chairman of the hospital and he talks after so much training and help and guidance. I cried. It was the first time we get to truly see Merrick act as a regular human being. At first he's talking in almost prompts, parroting back taught phrases until he recites a psalm in its entirety, stunning both Frederick and Carl Gom, which leads them both to realizing that not only is John Merrick capable of a communicative life, he's actually fluent and well-read and intelligent. This then brings on the unbearable realization that his life has become infinitely more depressing, knowing how intelligent he is and yet having to have lived this way. Carl Gom even has to emphasize to Frederick that neither of them and probably nobody on the planet can understand what he's gone through. Now, although Frederick becomes an incredible friend to Merrick, he teaches him about high society, he gets them both notoriety, he gets John friends, and even introduces him to women who were the first in Merrick's life to not meet him with horror in their faces. Frederick realizes that he's essentially turning John back into a curiosity, but for a higher class of people. He's now some sort of aristocratic freak show. It's this realization that haunts him, but in the end, it's human nature. I mean, we ourselves are yearning for a look at John initially too. It's in our nature to be intrigued by the abnormal. We have a wicked sensibility to expose ourselves to what we consider unnatural. And this isn't just an old way of thinking, this has evolved, and even though we recognize that these people aren't deformed, they're disabled, it still exists. Why do you think we have so many daytime shows about the lives of conjoined twins or little people or other disabilities? It's exactly what a freak show functioned as in centuries past, but on a much larger scale. The only difference is these human beings are given more empathy and freedom than they were, but even then that has a limit. But the principle is all the same. Frederick has this realization, he's succumbing to that natural human urge and decides to make a difference and change that. But sadly, there is another who works at the hospital who doesn't care nearly as much. He simply wants to exploit John for his own profit. This grows increasingly more sinister until an eventual scene that leads him to getting kidnapped by his former so-called owner. And this scene of Merrick being socially tortured and sexually assaulted is some of the most uncomfortable imagery I have ever witnessed. The scene is more horrific than almost any horror film could dream of showing. His life goes back off the rails until he's met with great empathy by his fellow curiosities and set free to go back home. But then he's sadly tormented and chased, and he delivers this heartbreaking line.
I am not an animal! I am a human being!
John Hurt as John Merrick is truly an all-time performance, even buried in an ungodly amount of prosthetics. Through his eyes and slurred speech, he delivers a presentation of sadness, emptiness, and eventually gratefulness and love. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's also a performance demanded by the script because eventually everybody becomes endeared by John, even the nurses who once found him hideous and, well, a freak. He displays his personality and love, and it captures those around him, as does his intelligence and creativity. He slowly builds this cathedral over the length of his stay at the hospital. The cathedral plays as a sort of metaphor for his journey. John can't actually see the cathedral he's basing this model off of, so he has to use his imagination and faith to finish it. Religion and faith is a theme throughout the whole film, namely in the form of Psalm 23, which we first hear him recite to Carl Gom and Frederick as previously mentioned. The meaning of that psalm is that God is a shepherd and he guides people through faith whether their life is filled with wealth or not, luck or misfortune. He's always with them. God in a way is symbolized by Frederick in Merrick's story, but most of all it represents his absolute dedication in believing in something. It represents his hope. Eventually, once the cathedral is built, Merrick's journey feels complete and he lets himself go. He chooses to lay down like a normal person, knowing it will kill him, and this way his final resting position is that of a normal person, and in a way, he will remain that way for eternity. He tells Frederick just before that he's blissful every day because he knows he's loved. He's experienced compassion and empathy in a way that no man has ever felt it, because he has felt fear in a way that no man has ever experienced it. It's an incredibly bittersweet ending. And you know, there is so much throughout the film that symbolizes how he's treated and seen, whether it be through empathy or fear, such as the contrasting back-to-back scenes that people read in the newspaper, one being a star of the theatre, wanting to meet him and treat him with respect, and the other being a man that wants to exploit him and profit from him. There's also the detail of who calls him by his name and who calls him the Elephant Man, and sometimes when they switch from the Elephant Man to John Merrick, and that simple detail tells you a lot about how they view John Merrick. And the film deviates a little from Merrick's real life, for instance his slight name change from Joseph to John, and in real life Joseph knew his mother and voluntarily joined the freak show as he had no other alternatives for work. But I think Lynch didn't want to make a biopic, he wanted to make a story, and that he did. Those minor changes make major differences in how we feel about Merrick as a character. Abandoned and sold and abused from birth drives home his later sweet few years. It's a wildly depressing and beautiful film that demonstrates the pure duality of man. The test of your character being whether you meet John Merrick with gross curiosity and fear, or unrelenting love and empathy. So have you seen The Elephant Man? If so, let me know what you think of it. Let me know what you think of this video. I read every single comment and reply to as many as possible, and whether it's a woefully painful character study from David Lynch or not, as always, keep watching movies.